Yes, you read that title correctly. A filing cabinet is responsible for the fall of an American president. In fact, this filing cabinet to be exact. This filing cabinet marks the beginning of a chain of events that would ultimately remove one of America's most notorious presidents from power, Richard Nixon, who you might know from such classics as losing the Vietnam War, starting the absolute failure that was the war on drugs, and overall just being a bit of a crook.
Well, I'm not a crook.
Shut it. Now, before I tell you about this government-ending piece of IKEA furniture, we have to rewind to 1967, and to a man by the name of Daniel Ellsberg. If you've seen the Netflix docuseries, Turning Point: The Bomb in the Cold War, you'll probably have seen him, if you weren't scrolling TikTok or whatever the kids do nowadays, and might know where this is headed. This old fella, who has now tragically passed away, was, in the mid-1960s, a defense analyst at the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. You know, that building that also got hit by a plane on 9/11, but everyone just seems to forget. It's been over 20 years and some people still do not know that, but I digress. He'd been recruited there by Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense under Kennedy and Johnson from the Rand Corporation, after working there and consulting the Eisenhower administration on nuclear warfare. Oh, yeah, this guy was part of the group planning the literal annihilation of humanity, but he's actually one of the good guys here. You see, in the mid-1960s, after Kennedy's melon getting juiced up and becoming an everlasting meme, the US had gotten itself far more involved in Vietnam, and McNamara was rightfully wondering how the hell they'd got so committed to a random country on the other side of the world. So, in 1967, he put together a team of 36 Pentagon analysts and gave them the task of piecing together how the US became so involved in Vietnam, with access to droves of classified government documents from the current and previous administrations, though they weren't allowed to interview anyone involved due to the secret nature of the project. Daniel Ellsberg is one of these 36 analysts that authors this secret history of American involvement in Vietnam, and while he's digging through over 2 decades of government files, what he discovers changes his entire worldview in an instant. In the course of writing this report, Ellsberg, along with his colleagues, discovered American involvement in Vietnam as early as 1945, and 2 decades of the government lying to the public about not only American involvement in the country, but about the entire nature of the conflict. On top of this, he discovers that the US had planned to supply their forces in South Vietnam with tactical nuclear weapons, and this was especially terrifying to Ellsberg. Quick side tangent, Ellsberg, while working as a consultant at Rand, became incredibly concerned with the US government's plans for nuclear attacks, and their disregard for the loss of life such use as they planned it would cause. In his later years, he's described the plans he saw as the worst plans anyone had ever created, and they would have resulted in the deaths of hundreds of millions. That's why he's so concerned about nuclear weapons in Vietnam. Okay, tangent over. Ellsberg is horrified by what he's discovered, and almost overnight goes from a hawk to a dove. Once the report is completed a year and a half later, just 5 days before Nixon is inaugurated, he demands to his superiors that they release it to the public, emphasizing that people need to know about the crucial information the report uncovered, but they refuse his demands. Ellsberg, in his mind, has a choice to make: to leak or not to leak. After some consideration, Ellsberg begins secretly making copies of the Pentagon's report on the Vietnam War in 1969, as well as his files on nuclear war planning from his time at Rand, with plans to distribute them to the press. For the next few months, late at night, he would take pieces of the 47-volume report, some 7,000 pages which filled a grocery cart, to an advertising agency run by a friend, and spend hours creating copies of the report. After some help from a Pentagon colleague, Anthony Russo, he gives copies of the Pentagon report to the New York Times in 1971, who publishes the first issue of their now famous series, known as the Pentagon Papers. Now, I'm in the process of making a full video on the papers themselves and their impact on the world, but here's what you need to know. The New York Times publishes the first edition on June 13th, 1971, and continues to publish new sections each day. The world is obviously shocked by the revelations of the papers, and the legitimacy of the Vietnam War is called even further into question. The US government, shitting their pants because one of their most secretive projects has just been released to the public, files a court order to stop publication of the papers, which they eventually lose in a landmark Supreme Court case. And Ellsberg is hunted by the FBI for nearly 2 weeks until he turns himself in at the federal courthouse in Boston. Unfortunately, he'd lost the copies of his Rand Corporation files during his time on the run, because of some unfortunate yet hilarious events. Ellsberg had intended to release his Rand files after dealing with the fallout of the Pentagon Papers, and had obviously needed to hide them in the meantime. He'd entrusted the files to his brother, who had buried them in a landfill, in case the FBI came knocking. But before either of them could recover them, a tropical storm had hit the area, and these copies were either destroyed, or are now part of the foundation of someone's house. Definitely an awkward moment at the next family reunion. Remember when this video was about a filing cabinet? Yeah, so here's where it comes in. The Justice Department charges Ellsberg and Russo with a number of crimes including espionage and conspiracy under the Espionage Act of 1917, with our friend Danny facing a maximum sentence of 115 years, because, he stole and leaked a bunch of classified government documents. He never denied stealing or leaking them, but neither Ellsberg nor Russo would ever spend a second in jail. Seems like a pretty open and shut case, right? So how did they avoid jail? Well, that's because Ellsberg leaked something under Richard Nixon's nose. And Nixon, famous for his temper and irrationality, didn't appreciate that too much, and in his rage, was prone to doing something stupid. You see, Nixon was furious about Ellsberg's leak, and wanted something done about him. He literally said to his chief of staff,
"Main balls Ellsberg. We gotta get this son of a bitch."
And Nixon, being Nixon, set up a new White House organization, off the books, in an unmarked office, known only as the White House Special Investigations Unit. No, not that. For this off-the-books unit, Nixon selected Eagle Crow, David Young, E. Howard Hunt, and G. Gordon Liddy. These 4 guys' purpose was to... how do I put this? Stop leaks. That sounds pretty convincing. In reality, they were to conduct intelligence operations for Nixon that he couldn't be publicly involved in, and would be the guys to quote-unquote get Ellsberg, or at least they would try to find information that would discredit him. On September 3rd, 1971, the unit's Cuban operatives are sent to break into Ellsberg's therapist's office, the office of Dr. Lewis Fielding, to get dirt on Ellsberg through notes his therapist had about him. And in this humble office in Los Angeles, California, sat a modest 4-drawer filing cabinet that would change the legacy of Richard Nixon. The unit's operatives broke in and took a crowbar to the locked filing cabinet, searching for incriminating information on Ellsberg in the cabinet, but after a short while, couldn't, and had to flee the scene lest they risk getting caught. Bloody government programs never doing anything right, can't even find a file in a filing cabinet. Even more hilariously, Ellsberg, in later years, said that the unit did find Fielding's file on him, they just didn't realize it had any value and had discarded it before leaving. In the file was a copy of a paper Ellsberg had written, in which he alludes constantly to classified materials he'd seen in the mid-60s, which was obviously the Pentagon Papers. During Ellsberg's trial 2 years later, this incident would spell the end of the government's case against Ellsberg and Russo, the judge dismissing the case on the grounds of government misconduct once the prosecution revealed that the break-in had happened. But by then, the dominoes had already begun to fall on Nixon. This unit would come to be more significant than just losing a court case for Nixon's government, and would spell the end of his government in its entirety. On Thanksgiving of 1971, after the failed Ellsberg operation, one of the members of the unit, David Young, had a conversation with his grandmother about what he did at the White House. "I'm helping the president stop some leaks," he is reported to have said, probably rather sarcastically, to which she is reported to have responded with, "Oh, so you're a plumber." And this name of the White House Plumbers would stick for the group. In fact, it would stick literally to their office door for a while, until someone told them to take it down, as they legally weren't supposed to even exist. The Ellsberg operation had been a failure, but Nixon and his administration weren't ready to disband their plumbers yet, and would soon task them with what would become the defining scandal of the Nixon administration, the Watergate break-in. Watergate was a luxury hotel in Washington, D.C., where the Democratic National Convention, Nixon's arch-enemies in government, were based. But today, the name is more commonly known as the basis for every scandal that wants a catchy namesake of its own. Liddy and Hunt put together a plan to bug the DNC offices to gain intelligence on the Democrats' campaign, an operation that, I shouldn't have to tell you, was completely illegal. On May 28, 1972, the Watergate crew, composed of CIA-recruited Cuban nationals, broke into the DNC offices to wiretap their telephones, and managed to complete the operation without any problems. Initially. As luck would have it, most of the wiretaps, while installed correctly, were faulty, and Liddy and Hunt, undeterred and committed to the bit, planned a second break-in. 3 weeks later, on June 17, 1972, the Plumbers Watergate crew, with the addition of former CIA agent James McCord, broke into the DNC headquarters at Watergate to replace the faulty wiretaps. But this time, their luck ran out and they were caught and promptly arrested. The Watergate crew had taped open an exit door, presumably so they could quickly get out the way they had come in, and a night security guard, upon finding the door and realizing someone must have entered the building, immediately called the DC police. The men were caught with, among other incriminating effects, materials directly connecting them to Hunt and the White House, an address book with Hunt's personal White House telephone number. This is what your tax dollars go to. Over the next year and a half, the scandal would unfold and unravel a conspiracy at the highest levels of government. Within days of the failed second break-in, a number of White House officials would meet to orchestrate a massive cover-up of the administration's involvement in the operation, headed by one John Dean, the White House counsel at that time. The trial of those caught in the burglary commenced in January 1973, and by March, the pressure was still growing on the White House, with those involved in the break-in still demanding more money from Nixon to cover legal fees, threatening to talk if their demands weren't met. Nixon meets with John Dean, and they discuss making payments of up to $1 million, with Nixon telling Dean, who had previously run the White House's quote-unquote investigation into the break-in, to write a new report so he could run another phony investigation. But instead of doing that, he went almost immediately to federal prosecutors to try to get immunity for himself by implicating other White House aides. The truly noble route. Days after Nixon and Dean meet, the judge in the Watergate break-in case reads aloud a letter from McCord telling of a wider conspiracy in the White House to cover up the incident before sentencing those involved in the break-in. Liddy and Hunt are both convicted after standing trial, with the others involved having pleaded guilty already. The situation would only deteriorate further for Nixon into April, when a number of officials would resign citing their involvement in the cover-up, including the director of the FBI, the Attorney General, and 2 White House aides, Bob Haldeman and John Ehrlichman, and Senate hearings would begin the next month. Testimonies into July would reveal Nixon's extensive taping system to the public, with the Senate demanding he turn over the tapes that would either convict or exonerate him. Just another quick tangent, since FDR was in office, every president had secretly taped conversations in the Oval Office and on the phone system therein. When Nixon took office, he removed Johnson's taping system, which was one that worked selectively and could be turned on or off at will, for a voice-activated one, meaning that every conversation Nixon had had, with or about the Plumbers and their operations, had been recorded whether he liked it or not. Okay, tangent over. Nixon would dodge every subpoena he received for the tapes like Neo between July and October 1973, until Nixon would shoot himself in the foot. Actually, no, he would blow his entire foot off. Following his vice president's resignation and the appointment of Gerald Ford to the position, Nixon would order the Attorney General Elliot Richardson and the Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaus to fire the prosecutor in the Watergate case, to which they both resigned in what became known as the Saturday Night Massacre. By now, it was obvious to everyone with a brain that Nixon had something to hide. Over the next few months, while proclaiming he was 100% not a crook, Nixon would surrender the tapes and the transcripts of them to the various investigations into the matter, following the Supreme Court ruling that his claims of executive privilege over them were void, resulting in Congress approving 3 articles of impeachment: obstruction of justice, misuse of power, and contempt of Congress, though he would never be formally impeached. Instead, he would slither his way out of the hands of justice by resigning from the presidency in August 1974, but was pardoned by his successor and former vice president, Gerald Ford. Other participants in the cover-up, not being the President of the United States, weren't so lucky, with the Attorney General John Mitchell and White House aides Bob Haldeman and John Ehrlichman getting between 2 and 8 years in prison for their roles. What had begun at that filing cabinet in Los Angeles had brought down the sitting President of the United States and his administration in the most infamous scandal in American political history. Fielding's filing cabinet set in motion the collapse of a once powerful man's entire career and reputation, and ultimately upended the nation's understanding of what their president was truly doing behind the secretive walls of the White House. His filing cabinet, and the subsequent failures of the Plumbers, did more damage to Nixon's presidency than any good that could have potentially come from their actions. Richard Nixon, the man that had uncovered a communist spy at the highest levels of government, served 2 terms as vice president under Eisenhower, and been elected president himself, was disgraced. Watergate, a stain on the entirety of his career, and crippling what would have been a conservative resurgence in America in the early 1970s, that would unfold more completely with Reagan's election in 1980. Had the Plumbers turned around at that filing cabinet? Potentially Watergate may not have happened, and Nixon's reputation only slightly tarnished, rather than totally obliterated. By breaking into Fielding's filing cabinet, Nixon, and those in his administration associated with the Plumbers, had committed themselves to continuing to do such acts, and set them on the course for their eventual downfall. It certainly wasn't the only factor in Nixon's disgrace, but without the Fielding break-in, the legacy of not only Nixon, but Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers leak could have been wildly different. Would Ellsberg and Russo have been convicted? Would Nixon's second term have unfolded differently had he not formed the White House Special Investigations Unit? Would the Pentagon Papers have had the same effect? Maybe, maybe not. It's impossible to say. But hey, if there was one man that greatly benefited from all of this, it was Gerald Ford. God damn, he really played the long game. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. I really appreciate it, and I hope you enjoyed the video, and maybe learned something new. If you did, please like the video and subscribe for more content, and I'll see you in the next one.